And we are recording. Sally, go ahead, take it away.
Awesome. So, hi everybody. I'm Sally Davis. My pronouns are she and her. I work for the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in the UK, and my job is software development in support of analysis and wargaming and simulation and training. But today I'm just going to be talking about WATU, which isn't really my day job. They're just the people who did my job during the war. So, Western Approaches is a story that is close to my heart. It's really the first time I saw people like me in history, ordinary women do my job, not superheroes, not prodigies, not women in the most extraordinary circumstances. I mean, the World War II narrative tends to be housewives or factory work, or the women that were handpicked for really extraordinary abilities and sent to Bletchley Park or to SOE. And it's not that I don't find their stories inspiring, I really do, but there's a sense of it's not me about them, that I wouldn't have been able to succeed in those spaces. And I'm not seeing a place in history where like being me would fit. So many of the stories that we tell about women in history are the most extraordinary kind. So Katherine Johnson inventing rocket science from first principles to get us to the moon, Admiral Grace Hopper inventing compilers and bugs and things, Florence Nightingale inventing data science. And these are really marvelous women, and we should absolutely talk about them. But if these are the only women in technical fields that we talk about, it leaves the rest of us who aren't geniuses feeling a little bit like we're doing it wrong and we're not doing enough. But here's WATU, staffed by women with the same kind of education that I've had, doing the kind of work that I do, like some of them living the life that I lead, and the work they did changed the course of the war. So there's women like me in history, and she made a valuable contribution to wargaming. And I think maybe men and white people and straight people and non-disabled people take for granted the ability to see yourself reflected in important moments in history, and how alienating it can feel when you don't see that. Because it all feeds into this idea of who we consider great, and who's allowed to be great and what's allowed to be great, and how we talk about that success. And as a culture, we like to talk about genius like Mozart or Katherine Johnson, and people who are just kind of born getting it, and their talent's clearly visible from the outset, and it's almost effortless. And we equate the talent with ease. So if you have to try hard and work hard to understand and struggle to improve, then that looks like a lack of ability. And if you're not already doing it, then maybe you're not good enough to do it at all. And we think in terms of singular genius, as if they exist in a vacuum, without influence or facilitation or teamwork, making their contribution great. So we assume that if doors haven't been opened for a person, it's because they lack ability. And we assume that if a person isn't at the wargaming table, it's because they're not cut out to be a wargamer, and they'd be here if they were good enough. So we're going to talk about perspectives and how WATU's perspectives made them excellent, and how wargaming is really perspective taking, and how women and minority perspectives get erased from wargaming, even when we're talking about WATU. So let's wind the clock back to February 1942. Britain stands alone in Europe. U-boats control the Atlantic, inflicting unsustainable losses on our merchant shipping. If nothing changes, Britain will be starved out the war in 3 months. So this is the Battle of the Atlantic. It's the longest battle of the war. It's a battle that provides the food, the munitions, the fuel, and the raw materials necessary to fight all the other battles. And I think it's easy to forget when we look at history that at the time we didn't know how it was going to turn out. We just suffered devastating losses at Dunkirk and during the Blitz. And I've spoken to Y service Wrens stationed on the south coast at the time, and they were genuinely afraid of German forces sneaking up the cliffs at night. So we were clinging on by our fingernails. And Churchill tasks a retired Navy commander, Roberts, find out what's happening in the Atlantic, find out how to sink the U-boats, and find ways of getting our convoys through. And Roberts, who used to run the tactical school at HMS Excellent in Portsmouth, says, "Very good, sir. I shall need men." And he gets a couple of men who are like him, unfit for duty at sea. So he was invalided out of the Navy before the war with TB, and Cousins is too old for sea, and Hyam was recently sunk out of HMS Audacity, and he's recovering physically and mentally. And the rest of the staff he gets are women. So what have women ever done for wargaming? Well, there's this marvelous quote from Air Chief Marshal Sir John Slessor, speaking in the 50s, and he credits WATU specifically with creating military operational research as we know it. So he says, One lesson of this battle, which I think is very important, is the value of the closest and most constant cooperation between the staffs and the scientists. Operational research was something new in this war, and in no field of warfare was its application more fruitful than in operations against U-boats. Before the war, I do not think it would ever have occurred to any officer that analysts in grey flannel bags and sometimes thick spectacles would in many respects be able to teach him his business in directing operations of war, and would tell him things which he did not know about the killing of U-boats. I have no hesitation from some little experience of command in war that the operational research scientist is an absolutely indispensable member of the fighting staff of any important headquarters in these modern times. So these Wrens, of course, are the analysts in grey flannel bags. And even when he's talking about WATU, he doesn't mention the women. So we're going to talk about WATU and what they did, why they're so successful at it, and how we've managed to unlearn all their lessons about diversity. But let's not kid ourselves that the Wrens had achieved equality at the time. WATU wasn't some kind of gender neutral utopia. So there was a question at Connections Online, how did WATU deal with bad behavior towards Wrens? And at the time I kind of fumbled the answer by saying, we don't have much evidence of it, when of course we do. Yeah, this has been the meta game of all of my WATU research, finding the women's names in the evidence at all, finding their voices, separating what they actually did and contributed from the trivializing male gaze that's quietly erased them from history. So when I said we don't have much evidence of it, I was thinking too narrowly. And none of the women complained about it specifically in print. But how and why would they when this is how the same women are described? So sorry about the quality. It's a very small newspaper article. The Wrens who take part in these operations find them of absorbing interest. And it goes on to reference the women by first names only and talk about the trivial things they did outside of the war before they came to WATU. You know, this is the same article that has Roberts as, he knows German, he knows the German mind. So it turns out that if you want to know about WATU and the war game and how it works so that you can play it being the backroom hero of the Battle of the Atlantic, you need to listen to a middle-aged woman of relatively low rank who knew her stuff but watched men get medals and awards for implementing her work, got dismissed as an expert in favor of men's perspectives and heap eating, and gets her name misspelt when she's credited at all. And I'm not talking about me, I am talking about leading Wren Helen Coop, who left us a 60-page notebook on contemporary ASW techniques and tactics and how to play the WATU game, complete with actual player move chips from WATU games and game pieces. And I found her, there she is on the right, with Janet O'Kell and Roberts. So what did men think of WATU Wrens at the time? Paul Strong makes the argument that people were too busy fighting the war to be prejudiced. And the truth is actually more complicated than that. Yes, respect was won, but I think it was often hard won, and it had to be won, and it didn't stick. There's no doubt that the WATU Wrens were respected for knowing their stuff. Here is Lieutenant Carol Hendry, later Duffus, speaking about her time at the Canadian Tactical Unit at HMS Statacona in Halifax. And she said, when the game was over, everyone would come up on the table and the whole thing would be criticized by the training commander. He would say to each of them, now in this case, perhaps it would have been better if you'd done this or that and so on. It was a good educational tool and I think they learned a lot that way. And you often hear about women being looked down on because they were women doing a certain job, but I never felt that, ever. I was treated with tremendous respect. I think that's probably why I advanced the staff officer training, because I was respected and I knew what I was doing and why I was there. I had no problem at all being a woman. And it's clear that there's a great deal of respect between respect and affection in both directions between the WATU staff and the RN officers that took the courses and ran the school with them. Several marriages result. So there's third officer, there's Hackney and Lieutenant Commander Judy Hawkins, there's Wren Judy Duvivier and Commander Pete and Gretton. There's leading Wren Doris Lawford and Lieutenant Maurice Bowyer. And Roberts gave all the Wrens glowing references at the end of the war. So here's the end of Helen Coop's. Miss Coop is a good mixer. She has a very quick brain and a good sense of humor. And writing in the 70s, Roberts described his first batch of Wrens as the 4 Wren officers, Liz Drake, Laura Howes, Jean Laidlaw, Nan Wales, were real gems. The job was totally new to them, but their enthusiasm was contagious. And Helen Coop, in return, is quoted in 1979 newspaper. Miss Coop summed it up when she said, he's a marvelous man and he's a brilliant man in the war. he was written to us, he's written to some of us letters several pages long, full of chat every Christmas. And leading Wren, June Duncan, said, I went to see Roberts in Exeter Hospital 30 years after the WATU days. He was riddled with arthritis, but his brain was sharp as ever, and I was hard put to it not to salute as I left his bedside. So these guys respect each other enormously. But at the same time, director of Wren's, David Lawton Matthews, was also putting up with a fair amount of this sort of behaviour. So she says, I was told one of the London units that a naval officer had telegraphed or telephoned for a shorthand typist, adding, we don't mind about the shorthand, but please some good looks. We haven't been very well served here. And WATU was not immune to this kind of disrespect, quiet disrespect towards the Wrens either. So there's the famous passage from Commander Winnie, where he says, I was sent off to the tactical school in Liverpool, run by Captain Roberts, with a small staff and some very bright Wrens. We, all commanding officers, will be placed in small cubicles, able to see only a small portion of the ocean battlefield laid out on the floor. And each would have to tell an attendant Wren what we would do in a set of different circumstances as the battle progressed. I remember handing my written answer to a particularly clued up girl. No, sir, I don't think you should do that, she said firmly and politely. Good God, I thought, what on earth does this girl know about it? Such was her confident, tactful tone, however, that meekly I said, oh, why not? And she explained convincingly. It was an astonishingly effective setup. So I know that to a lot of men, this reads as a compliment. And it is complimentary about Wren Judy de Vivier, later Gretton. That's Gretton beside her there, not Commander Winnie. But it also begins with the assumption that de Vivier, despite being assigned to a training role where her job is literally to train escort officers like Winnie, it begins with the assumption that she's incompetent at her job until she proves otherwise to him. You might think that if de Vivier were clueless, she'd have been removed from the role. And yet Winnie's starting point for his lens on this encounter is that she's an ignorant child. And the use of girl is, it's just not appropriate. Nobody's calling RN officers of the same age boys. And it's worth remembering that boy has always been used to infantilize Black men by diminishing their status compared to white men. And this is a common theme of how the WATU Wrens are discussed today. So leading Wren Janet O'Kell is frequently infantilized as a schoolgirl, with this fixation on her bursting into tears on her first day. She was 18. The Wrens are collectively portrayed as having no experience on arrival. In fact, several of them had university degrees before joining the Wrens. Many of them came to WATU after years as plotters in the map room or staff officers elsewhere in Western Approaches HQ. And I imagine a lot of people tell the story this way because it makes the Wrens' achievements seem greater, to go from nothing and children to heroes instead of technically competent adults to heroes. And it can certainly seem like a compliment. But it's also a way of infantilizing the women and their achievements. It's saying any women could have done this, rather than allowing that the success of WATU was due in large part to these particular women and their skills and their experience. And it's a way of making them safe. If they're children, they're not as emasculating as confident grown women, capable in command of themselves and their lives and gasp, demanding equal treatment. And is respecting their technical ability not enough? Do we have to use backhanded compliments of childish inexperience that carry this undertone of who to believe they could even do this, astonishment, rather than good on women for their success? Because the thing is that women already played this game in the First World War. They already proved their competence. They already won the respect of the Navy after suffering unwarranted attacks on their competence. So back to David Lawton Matthews. The old chief petty officer in charge of the cooks was overheard to say, of all the horrible things that have happened in this horrible war, the horriblest was these women coming here. I thought this worthy of posterity and printed it in the WRNS Souvenir Journal, which I edited after the 1918 war, hence its fame. I might add that the same CPO finally clamored to keep his Wren cooks. So I find it rather delicious that this CPO is thoroughly convinced that women couldn't possibly cook. I can just imagine his indignant, get back in the kitchen. Oh, no, not my kitchen. And it wasn't just that women had to win the respect, they had to do it in an unsupportive environment where any failure was a failure of all women, and their successes were down to exceptionalism. It wasn't women as a broad category that were found to be capable and competent in 1918, so that come 1939, women were given a pass as competent until individuals proved otherwise. It was the individual successful women of 1918 were the individual successful women. And come 1939, all women had to fight anew for their already hard-won respect. So Lord Matthews again, both in 1918 and 1939, women were put into naval offices with no training, no experience, and often no help, if they did not make the grade, sweeping verdict was women are no good. The miracle was how many of them did compete successfully and emerge after a long period of learning with sweat and tears as useful members of His Majesty's service. And this wasn't just happening in the Navy. Several of the Wrens had university degrees in maths and social science. But in 1932, when Beatrice Shilling, who wasn't a WATU Wren, graduated from the University of Manchester with an honours degree in engineering, she was listed as Mr. on her report card. Female titles weren't an option back then. And she frequently got job interview rejections that began Sir, in spite of being addressed to Miss B. Shilling. Language is such an important thing. When you use it in a way that renders women and minorities invisible, it's dehumanizing. It's a kind of gaslighting. It's saying, we don't recognize that a woman is capable of earning a degree, even as she's earning that degree, even as she's applying for jobs with that degree. It's saying, we don't want you here. We don't even accept that you are here. And the war didn't magically fix this. So thanks, patriarchy. 34 years after their contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, the only thing the newspapers have to say about the WATU Wrens is to frame them as sex objects to an octogenarian. Mrs. Roberts is not in the least bit jealous of these young Wrens. And when women exceed expectations, it's often met with a kind of bemusement, and it's almost treated as a joke. So Beatrice Shilling again, in 1934, she became the second woman to be awarded the Brooklands Gold Star for breaking 100 miles an hour on the motorbike track. And at one job interview, the subject of her Brooklands success came up, and they said, I suppose the men let you win. And her reaction was to laugh in his face. She went on to work for RAE Farnborough, so another DSDL alum, and single-handedly solved the Spitfire and Hurricane fuel injection problem that plagued our aircraft during the Battle of Britain. So in 1939, Chief Yeoman Bernard Rayner, who was on staff at WATU, was awarded the British Empire Medal for being General Dog's Body of Wargaming at WATU. What did a Wren have to do to earn the same reward? So in 1943, only one Wren in the whole country was awarded the Empire Medal. And what did she have to do to earn it? She dragged a burning man from an exploding swordfish, beat the flames out with her bare hands, and dragged him 8 miles in search of a hospital. And even when she does that, it gets written up in a book that first recognized her boobs and curves. So we have a medal pinned to her proudly heaving breast and her vital statistics. Shame on you, John D. Drummond. And just in case any men were feeling too emasculated by his 1960s book on women's wartime heroism, he takes care to quietly remind us that she's not that good looking anymore. What a nasty little word then can be. So perspectives are really what WATU does best, taking different perspectives. And red teaming is really just perspective taking, right? That's what wargaming is, putting yourself in the shoes of the opposition, trying to understand what they're thinking so that you can outmaneuver them. And it works best when you respect their intelligence and dignity and humanity, when you try to understand their motivations without falling prey to stereotypes. Red teaming is an act of empathy. And one of the reasons that WATU was so good at red teaming is because women and minorities have always been expected to do the emotional work of a conversation, to keep the interests and emotions of straight, white, non-disabled men front and center. It's not a skill that the Wrens needed to learn when they became wargamers. They came already knowing how to consider the other person's perspective above their own, how to smile and say, thank you so much for that backhanded compliment. So in 2018, I ran a reconstruction of the WATU game at Western Approaches HQ, and reconstructing the game was an exercise in red teaming our understanding of the work that WATU did. It's kind of like the reconstructive archaeology at Geddelong Castle, figuring out how they built a castle by trying to build a castle. It's playtesting history. So I had a bunch of fixed points in time and space. I knew that there were view givings. I knew that the U-boat tracks were not visible to the players. And I knew that the Wrens moved the ships based on player orders and then reported back to the players what had happened. But that was really it. That was all I knew. And what I discovered was kind of magical. So there's that story of Newton sitting under a tree and the apple falls on his head and boom, he realizes gravity. And you and I could sit under that tree and, all we'd think is, ow. Wouldn't have been able to make that leap. And there's Gregor Mendel growing peas and figuring out dominant and recessive genes. And there's the patch-conic approximation in orbital mechanics. These are all things that I can understand and use when the science is explained to me, but they're not leaps that I could have made myself. So here I am playtesting the WATU game, and I start to see things emerging in play that Roberts talks about. So this idea of trawling up a U-boat by sending all the escorts to the rear of the convoy, I presumed this was some kind of devious U-boat tactic, and that it took some genius insight from Roberts to make that leap. And it's just a naturally emergent property of the game. So when you have a convoy that's moving at 6 or 7 knots and a U-boat that can do 3 knots submerged, the U-boat just gets left behind by the convoy as it steams on after a torpedo. Nor does its torpedo at the merchant ship, and the convoy leaves them behind. And of course it does. And it's not that Roberts had some tactical genius insight here. It's just that he framed the problem correctly, playing with a moving convoy rather than having the convoy as a stationary reference for the game to play around. And maybe that decision is Roberts' genius. Maybe he just didn't want to have to think about all the maths of the relative speeds of escorts and U-boats. Maybe he was just thinking this is how we've always done it with capital ships games when we're playing Jane's Fighting Ships. So I started looking through the narratives in the monthly anti-submarine reports, looking at Convoy HD 76. So this is the one where Walker famously deployed his buttercup tactic to claim 3 U-boats. And WATU was literally founded to prove that this was achieved more by luck than tactical insight. And what I found really surprised me. I was expecting this to be a really hard problem that took a tactical genius to solve. And actually it was all there in plain sight. The U-boats are inside the convoy. This wasn't unknown. In the reports of the proceedings, they're literally talking about one U-boat casually reloading on the surface for half an hour between a stricken merchant ship and the rest of the convoy. And we knew the range on a torpedo and that it was less than the size of an entire convoy, and that the ships on the outside of the convoys weren't being picked off first. So the genius of WATU wasn't some apple falling light bulb moment of connection. It was just the ability to look at the data and not get caught up in groupthink. Because this is what the Admiralty thought the U-boats were up to. They presumed it was just a geometry problem. If you fire the U-boat from outside, fire the torpedo from outside the convoy, odds are you'll hit something. So of course that's what they must be doing, right? Maximize the chances of any one torpedo hitting something. And of course it wasn't like that. The U-boats were not allowed to claim a sinking if they couldn't identify the ship that they'd sunk and the tonnage of it, in very much the same way that Admiralty told escorts wreckage or it didn't happen over claims of depth charting a U-boat. So they had to get in close and observe it and figure out the silhouette in their copy of Jane's Merchant Ships to decide what the ship was. And it's even sort of obvious, red teaming thought, the Admiralty demands proof of a kill. Why are we assuming the Kriegsmarine doesn't? Why are we not allowing the enemy as much thoughtfulness and intelligence as ourselves? And the Wrens came to this problem with a completely different mindset to the RN officers. They were able to say, well, what if all our assumptions are wrong? What if the U-boats are inside the convoy? And the Wrens were capable of solving this problem, and they were involved, they engaged in thinking about these issues. They weren't just passively holding the tea while Robert stroked his chin and thought all this stuff up. So the genius of WATU is really in the culture of how they did. So first of all, the game is pitch perfect. It represents the real world accurately enough to make and test tactical hypotheses for analytical games without overwhelming the non-analyst player in the training games. It's flexible enough to focus on the mid-Atlantic escort tactics and littoral coastal forces tactics. So the Mediterranean is a completely different kind of fight to the deep water mid-Atlantic battles, and different again to the little ships operating in the channel against E-boats and S-boats. But it's able to represent all of these, and it's able to continually evolve with the technological and strategic developments of the war. More than the game, though, the WATU becomes a hub for information exchange and cooperation between staff officers and escort officers, scientists and analysts, Royal Navy, RAF. The game is played within spitting distance of the Atlantic plot. Roberts has an intelligence role in Western Approaches Command, so he's got an ear to Ultra, His staff include escort officers on rotation from duty at sea. So very little of interest happens at sea or in wardroom discussions that isn't relayed to WATU. And these ideas feed into the analytical game, and then new tactics can be quickly disseminated back out to the fleet and practiced on the tactical course. And there's really 4 things that made WATU excellent at that. So the first is that they understood the purpose. They understood why. Why are we gaming? What questions are we trying to answer? And how can we best do that? So there were almost no barriers to entry to this game for escort officers. They interface with the game exactly the same way that they receive information and give orders on their bridge. They came knowing the rules of the game, how to plot course, how to maneuver a ship, how to chase a U-boat contact. They didn't have to learn how to play the game or how to drive Discord or something like that. They could just focus on rehearsing tactics and teamwork. And it also meant that the lessons they learned were directly applicable to the real world problem. They didn't learn to win the WATU game, they learned to beat the U-boat problem. So WATU became this hub for information for the U-boat problem. So they debriefed escort commanders after a convoy and listened to what they did and what worked and what they saw or what was new or unexpected. And they invited suggestions for ideas to try out in the analysis games. And they had an ear to naval intelligence from Bletchley, and they could pick up the phone to boffins at torpedo schools or experienced submariners when they had a hypothesis about enemy capability or reasoning. And they listened, but they also looked at the data and they recognized when our assumptions were wrong. And most of all, they were able to communicate this effectively to the escort officers taking part on the courses and using their tactics. And it's this constant two-way conversation that's a large part of how WATU was able to respond effectively to the changes in technology and enemy tactics throughout the Battle of the Atlantic. The WATUans were really good at empathy. So that ability to imagine what another person is thinking, to recognize their emotions, stay out of judgment and communicate that understanding. Empathy is the #1 skill of red teaming, being able to think yourself into the mind of the opposition and understand their motivations and reasoning without falling prey to stereotypes and biased thinking, and to use that understanding to formulate an effective counter strategy. It's also the #1 skill of teamwork, being able to understand your teammates, communicate your understanding to them, listen when they do the same, to value their input because it's not their own, especially when it's different to your own, to become the sum that is greater than the individual parts. So what made the WATU Wrens so good at the analysis game made them equally good at the training game, understanding what the player's comprehension is, what it needs to be, and the most effective way to get him to that level. So they used the game to generate empathy between players. And WATU played such an important part in the role coordinating RAF Coastal Command and the escort ships by making them play together and understand each other's difficulties and needs. And the real biggie, diversity. So the WATU Wrens came from literally all walks of life. There were women from across empire, refugees from occupied Europe, women with English as a second language, working class to daughters of barons, housewives, students, professional women, women with backgrounds in maths, science, drama and performance, nursing, teaching, raw recruits, experienced naval plotters and staff officers. There were Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, white and black and brown, gay and straight. The men on the staff were unfit for duty at sea through illness or injury or recovering from the stress of duty at sea. So between them was the cultural and social and interdisciplinary technical knowledge to speak to everybody in the Allied navies and be heard. And it's that wealth of diversity and life experience that's so important for how they were able to think themselves into the shoes of other people and understand what the U-boats are up to in the analysis game, and then communicate that effectively to players in the training games and to the stakeholders in Western Approaches Command and in government. Diversity is hard, and it's effective because it's hard. So I want to quote from the marvelous Dr. Sarah Ahmed. It's quite a long quote. So she says, when you challenge how spaces are occupied, you learn how spaces are occupied. Sometimes it might seem obvious. There could be a sign on the door that tells us a facility is currently being used. Spaces can be occupied without the use of such signs. Spaces can be occupied by being intended for specific purposes. When spaces are intended for specific purposes, they have bodies in mind, and perhaps we can more easily tell whom spaces are intended for when those whom they are not intended turn up. I use the image of a postbox that has become a nest as an example of what I call queer use, how things can be used in ways that they were not intended for, or by those for whom they were not intended. The birds turned a small opening intended for letters into a door, a way of getting in and out of the box. Of course, the postbox can only become a nest if it stops being used as a postbox, hence the sign, "Please do not use the postbox," addressed to would-be posters of letters. I'm aware that this is a rather happy, hopeful image. Queer use is rarely about just turning up and being able to turn a box into a nest or a room into a shelter. To open up spaces to those for whom they were not intended often requires a world dismantling effort. You might have to fight for room, room to be, room to do your work without being questioned or being put under surveillance. You might have to fight for content that does not enact your disappearance, or to have portraits on walls or names on buildings that do not celebrate your dispossession. That fight can be how we acquire wisdom. We know so much from trying to transform worlds that do not accommodate us, and trying seems the right word. It can be trying. When you have to keep fighting for an existence, fighting can become your existence. So Dr. Ahmed says that fighting can become your existence. In essence, your existence begins to feel like the problem. So in disability culture, we talk about the medical and the social models of disability. The medical model says the person who can't walk is disabled. The social model says the person who uses a wheelchair is not the problem. Steps without ramps are the problem. Society enables some people and disables others by choosing to build steps instead of ramps. So sometimes a difficult concept for non-disabled people to take seriously, because there's an unconscious assumption of less worth and less value associated or attached to people with disabilities. But less value than who? And we see the same measuring of all minorities and the same default assumptions of less worth and other. And science is here to tell you that all of your assumptions are wrong. So we're evidence-based decision makers. So I thought I'd give you a rundown of science that backs up diversity is good, and we should have more of it, please. So diversity improves performance by making people work harder. The 2009 study looked at the effect on performance in a murder mystery task, where a group is joined by a newcomer from a different fraternity or sorority. The more diverse groups, those joined by someone from the outgroup, judged the team interactions to be less effective than the groups joined by insiders. They were also less confident in their final decisions. Working with people like you is easy, feels like success. Working with people who are different to you is hard work. Because there's friction, it feels like you're doing it wrong. But among groups where all three original members didn't already know the correct answer, adding an outsider versus an insider increased their chance of arriving at the correct solution from 29% to 60%. The work felt harder, but the outcomes were better. Diversity produces better outcomes precisely because it's harder. We argue that allying with an outgroup newcomer can represent a threat to one's social relationships with fellow in-group members, which leads to an increased task focus that results in superior performance for old-timers in the group. Diversity improves communication. Another murder mystery study, this time with the facts of the case spread among the participants, so that each participant was the only one in the group to know certain information. In other words, the team needed to share everything they knew to solve the mystery. The groups with racial diversity significantly outperformed the groups with no racial diversity. Being with similar others leads us to think we all hold the same information and share the same perspective. This perspective, which stopped the all-white groups from effectively processing the information, is what hinders creativity and innovation. Diversity improves the diligence of groups. So in a study involving 200 participants on 29 mock juries, panels of white and black people performed better than all white groups. Such diverse juries deliberated longer, raised more facts about the case, and conducted broader and more wide-ranging deliberations. They also made fewer factual errors in discussing the evidence, and when errors did occur, these errors were more likely to be corrected during discussion. This difference was primarily due to significant changes in white behavior. White people on diverse juries cited more case facts, made fewer mistakes in recalling facts and evidence, and pointed out missing evidence more frequently than did those on all white juries. They were also more amenable to consider racism as a cause in their, of the deliberation when in diverse groups. Diversity prevents poor preparation. A 2013 study asked students their political affiliation and then asked them to present their theory on a murder mystery. So we asked the subjects to prepare for a meeting with another group member by writing an essay communicating their perspective. We told the participants that their partner disagreed with their opinion, but they would need to come to an agreement with this other person. So everybody was told to convince their meeting partner to come round to their side. Half the subjects were told to prepare to make their case to a member of the opposing political party, and the other half to make their case to a member of their own party. The result, people who were told that someone of the same political affiliation disagreed with them prepared less well for the discussion than people that were told that someone of another political affiliation disagreed with them. When disagreement comes from a socially different person, we are prompted to work harder. Diversity jolts us into cognitive action in ways that homogeneity does not. For this reason, diversity appears to lead to higher quality scientific research. Diversity reduces groupthink. Researchers from several universities studied stock picking in ethnically homogeneous and diverse groups. In homogeneous markets, traders place undue confidence in the decisions of others. They are less likely to scrutinize others' decisions, and traders are more likely to accept prices that deviate from the true values. More diverse teams made more accurate pricing decisions, leading to fewer bubbles in the market. Their picks were 58% better than the picks of homogeneous groups. The mere presence of diversity changed the tenor of decision-making among all traders. Diversity benefited the market, not only by providing variety in perspectives and skills, but because diversity facilitates friction that enhances deliberation and upends conformity. Diversity trumps homogeneity, and diversity trumps ability. An economics lecturer set out to create a computer simulation that would demonstrate to his students in his complex systems analysis class that, as the best and brightest, they could expect to outperform the competition routinely as long as they applied themselves and worked effectively together as teams. He created a computer simulation in which his team of very able students competed against less able and more diverse problem solvers. Because his very able problem solvers had, by definition, the better problem solving skills, it was his expectation that as a team, they would outperform the team of less able but more diverse problem solvers. In fact, what he did was accidentally create the mathematical proof that the best team is not necessarily made of the best individual performers, but of the individual performers who are best able to work together as a team. And specifically, that many hard problems are easier to solve when viewed through the correct frame, and that diversity increases your chances of someone finding that correct perspective. Diversity increases citations and research impact. A 2014 study looked at 1.5 million academic papers and found that research teams with less ethnic diversity produced papers with lower impact factors and fewer citations than other papers. Two variables that reflect the diversity of authors and the knowledge they use in the paper, which are the number of addresses and the number of references cited, are strongly associated with publishing in a higher impact journal and gaining more citations. A reasonable interpretation is that greater diversity and breadth of knowledge of research teams contributes to the quality of scientific papers that the team produces. Minority experts, or minority analysts are excellent, actually. So Wenneris and Wold wanted to determine why, despite the increasing numbers of doctoral degrees for women in science worldwide, men still dominated the highest levels of academic research. The presumption is they're just not good enough. The reality is much more infuriating. So peer reviews gave female applicants lower scores than male applicants who displayed the same level of scientific productivity. In fact, for the most productive group of female applicants, containing those with 100 total impact points or more. So that group was the only group of women judged to be as competent as the least productive group of male applicants, those whose members had fewer than 20 total impact points. So a female applicant had to be 2.5 times more productive than a male applicant to receive the same competence score. They also found that Although the selection policy did not allow biased reviewers to participate in scoring of applicants that they were associated with, so in this case, the panel member would recuse themselves from judging, the neutral committee members, so everybody else, compensated for this by raising their scores when judging applicants affiliated with one of their peers. And this affiliation bonus was of the same magnitude as the male gender bonus. Hence, being of the female gender and lacking personal connections was a double handicap of such severity that it could hardly be compensated for by scientific productivity alone. So let's revisit those last two studies. Freeman and Huang also found by regression analysis that the last author on a paper, who's typically a supervisor or senior researcher, is the gateway to publication in more prestigious journals. Wennerus and Wold found by similar analysis that affiliation with academic royalty is a similar gateway to peer review success. So they both find that the reason it's still male and pale at the top is gatekeeping. It's who senior people choose to associate with. So senior people open and close doors for the next generation, and who you collaborate with, who you write papers with, who you invite to participate in your war games and your studies, and who you mentor, who you invite to speak at your conferences and events makes a really big difference. With great power comes great responsibility. So let's return to the excellent Dr. Sarah Ahmed. Remember the post box that had become a nest? There could have been another sign, birds welcome. That sign would have been non-performative if the post box was still in use, because the birds would be dislodged by the letters, the nest destroyed before it could be created. Diversity is that sign. Birds welcome, minorities welcome. Just because you're welcomed, it does not mean they expect you to turn up. You might turn up only to be told, get back in your own box. When diversity is that sign, diversity is doing more than covering over the hostility of an environment. Diversity is the hostility of an environment. All it takes for someone to be dislodged or dispossessed is for what usually happens to happen. Comments, jokes, assertions, questions. Who are you? What are you doing here? Where are you from? These are a hostile environment. They function as letters in the box, piling up until there's no room left, no room to breathe, to nest, to be. From the letters we learn not only that the occupation of space is material, that dispossession is material, but that occupation and dispossession are achieved by the same materials. For some to be in the room requires stopping what usually happens in the room. Otherwise, they would be, as it were, displaced by the letters in the box. To open up spaces, you have to stop what usually happens from happening. You have to stop the same letters from being posted. So diversity and inclusion is Wargaming's Battle of the Atlantic. It's the thing that's going to give us all the means to be awesome at our other wargames. And to open up that space, you have to stop what usually happens from happening. So what if WATU refused to red team? Going back to 1984, Britain stands alone in Europe. The rate we're losing shipping will be starved out of the war in 3 months. And you, Churchill, summon Roberts and say, find out what's happening in the Atlantic, find ways of sinking the U-boats, and record scratch. He interrupts you and says, what about merchant ships? Merchant ships have diversity too. What if every time that WATU tried to have a conversation about what the U-boats were up to, somebody would come up with, well, how do you know it's the U-boat sinking merchantmen? Have you seen them do it? You know, maybe someone else is firing those torpedoes. These ships are sinking for other reasons. Maybe some of them just aren't seaworthy. You know, Atlantic storms are pretty bad. I'm sure the U-boats don't mean anything by it. The problem's that Britain's not more self-sufficient. Relying on empire like this is a fool's economy. I don't have time to keep up with all these newfangled wolfpack tactics. You know, newfangled two-stick torpedoes. I'm not at sea. Why is it really my problem anyway? You're making merchant ships feel guilty about being sunk. Imagine if every time that WATU tried to figure out what the escorts needed to do to sink U-boats, somebody butted in with, you know, hold up there. I wanted to keep the merchant shipping's emotions and interests front and center because they didn't respect the humanity and dignity of the U-boat captains. If your perspective is that women and minority wargamers are less than, you're going to apply that same presumption of superiority to red teaming in your wargames. And the enemy is going to ruthlessly take advantage of you and defeat you because you don't respect their humanity and intelligence. To open up spaces, we have to stop what usually happens from happening. And what usually happens is the same tired arguments that don't quite make sense, that don't have evidence to back them up. And they're really just a how-to for how to be bad at wargaming. So things like, I don't have time to keep up. So times are changing, language is constantly evolving. The words that used to be considered acceptable aren't so acceptable anymore or are actively harmful. This isn't a new concept, but some people's response to that is to throw their hands up and say, well, I don't have time to keep up, as if recognizing the previously or less recognized humanity of marginalized people is some sort of silly fad or nonsense. And how do you think it feels to people in those marginalized communities to hear that our lives and our identities and the labels we use to make sense of our experiences are not worthy of understanding? If we work in a science and technology organization, it's our job to keep up with new and published research and technology. So why is D&I any different? Like, allies are not special people. They're no less busy than the rest of us, but they are willing to put in the work to empathize with their colleagues and understand where they're coming from. And there kind of isn't really an acceptable reason not to do that. D&I is lowering standards. Well, I think science has conclusively shown that that's wrong. Not only because gatekeeping selects for more qualified women and minority wargamers. I have a first in rocket science. Yida Wong has 5 degrees. Come back when everyone in wargaming has that much qualification, and we can maybe consider this point. The mere presence of diversity makes straight, white, non-disabled men work harder. So how is it a bad thing? Something else that Page's simulation proved is that the benefits of diversity are exponential. For every new perspective, you get more benefit. It keeps piling up. It's not just, oh, I have one non-white face now, we're good, I've done diversity. It's like printing new perspective money. We have a tendency to overestimate the distinctions between people like ourselves. So, that guy's been to Oxford, he's completely different to a guy that's been to Cambridge. But to put other people who are different to us in these vast monolithic boxes, as if all women or all Black people or all Asian people or all queer people or all disabled people have lived the same experience and think the same way. Women and minorities would be in these posts already if they were good enough. So we're back to that myth of singular genius, where the very definition of ability and talent is that the doors are opened for you. And if they're not, it's because you weren't good enough. So gatekeeping is what is shutting the doors, not necessarily the ability of people trying to get in. And it's worth remembering that not a single man wanted to be at WATU. All of them were, when can I get out of here? When can I get back to the real war? And they couldn't leave fast enough. The women got that opportunity because men didn't want it. They were allowed to, and they excelled. So think of how many other people could excel if they were just allowed to participate in wargaming. And WATU wasn't this one-time apple falling moment of tactical genius that solved the U-boat problem on the spot overnight. It can't be credited to a single person in a single moment. It was teamwork and an evolution of tactics, and everybody contributed, from the chaps taking the tactical school course to the satellite schools in Canada and Bombay and Sierra Leone. Roberts alone was not diversity. He was not a successful tactical school on his own. And Roberts alone cannot tell the story of WATU. But everybody's been going by this account of WATU in Captain Gilbert Roberts, RN, and the Anti-U-Boat School, published by Mark Williams in the 70s. And it turns out this book is 50% Roberts' own uncredited handwritten memoir, and the rest is contributed by Williams. And Roberts was in his 80s at this point, and he was nearly blind, and his memory was going. And despite his huge respect and friendship with many of the Wrens, he's misspelled all their names. He's got mixed up about who made officer. Lady Wren Janet O'Kell was never an officer. Please stop saying that she was. She's not in the Navy list. And he confuses tactics for one another. So I'm sure that the Raspberry incident happened with, what should we call it? Raspberry, because to Hitler. But the account that Roberts gives of the tactic, that all the escorts race to the rear of the convoy and troll up a U-boat, it's not Raspberry. This is Raspberry. That is not all the U-boats going to the back, or all the escorts going to the back of the convoy. This is actually much closer to Walker's Buttercup. All the escorts turn outward from the convoy firing star shells. And WATU getting the credit and the glory and the widespread use of their tactic while Walker's Buttercup was binned goes a long way to explain Walker's refusal to take the WATU course. So Robert's memory was failing, he misremembered things, and the Williams book kind of took credit for his writing and didn't corroborate the details. In Williams' defense, all the official sources that I'm looking at now that show Raspberry doesn't look the way that Roberts recounts it, these were all sealed until the mid-70s after the book was published under the Official Secrets Act. Roberts didn't spill. So here is a letter from Mark Williams to Roberts saying, basically, you're on the hook for this Official Secrets Act. And throughout, Roberts is incredibly coy about the actual tactics. He barely says anything about the details. So Williams didn't have access to these documents. We can't blame him for his mistake. But this is where the narrative gets really interesting, because we have contemporary books written off the Williams account that include diagrams from those sealed documents that still don't pick up on the disconnection. Perils of publishing technical content without necessarily understanding it. And secondly, who was at the launch party for Williams' book? A handful of Wrens, pictured smiling and thrilled to read of their wartime exploits in contemporary newspaper articles. The same Wrens whose names are misspelled and ranks misremembered. So one of those Wrens, she's not even mentioned in the book, on the left there is Helen Coop. Helen, daughter of a canon from that previous newspaper article. And I was able to track her down summer before last, because there just aren't that many canons who had a daughter of about the right age called Helen. And her father turns out to have covered himself in glory at the Battle of the Somme, and he was canon at the Liverpool Cathedral, so his family was very findable. And I got in touch with her nephew, and he said she was a very popular aunt and great aunt. Whenever we told our children that Auntie Helen was coming to see us, they would reply, "Oh, good," which was not the response they gave for any other ancient relative. So he also knew Janet O'Kell. So Coop and O'Kell had both taken management positions in Liverpool after the war, and they met for lunch every week until retirement. So he had met Janet O'Kell over the years. And then he said to me, she left some things, I'll dig them out for you. And those things turned out to be a scrapbook of her war and a notebook. So this is the first-hand account of WATU written at the time by a WATU Wren while she was at WATU, detailing the tactics and the WATU game. So Williams didn't have access to these documents. You know, she was sitting at the dinner table next to him while they were celebrating the book launch, and she was photographed and interviewed by newspaper journalists at the time, and none of them thought to ask, Helen, what do you know about tactics? You know, which of these sounds like Raspberry to you? Go to the back of the convoy and trawl it up. So she's been sat there at the table when his book was published, and she's been right there in all the newspaper articles and research when other books have been written. So she's been just as findable and just as valuable a first-hand source, and just as elided from the narrative when it's told by men telling women's stories by focusing on how men felt about women's stories. So nil point for the patriarchy, goose eggs. So for the non-Brits, goose eggs is a score of 0 in cricket. And this is an actual movement chit from the WATU game, saved by Helen Coop, by Lieutenant Commander Peter Markham Scott. And he's clearly upset that his ASDIC got him no results, and he's drawn goose eggs to represent keep ASDICing for me, I'm still looking. So Helen saved all the funny movement chits, they're great. So culture war is politics by another means. It's not an accident that certain people's stories get told and certain people get left out of the stories. And yes, Marie von Clausewitz wrote the book after his death. More than that, she did half the research and all the editing and penned a good number of his most famous statements, including war is politics by other means. So when you quote von Clausewitz on Wargaming, you're quoting a woman on Wargaming. And yet it's taken until this point in my career for me to see women in historical wargaming because they've just been quietly kind of pushed to the side. So let's take another perspective and think about what Grimm's fairy tales have to teach us about diversity and inclusion. So once upon a time, there was a queen who possessed a magic mirror. And every morning she asked magic mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the mirror always said the queen was the fairest, and this pleased her because the mirror never lied. Then one day the mirror told the queen that Snow White was the fairest of them all, and this gave the queen a great shock. She became envious, and in that moment her heart turned against Snow White. The queen used all her magic to make herself old and ugly to facilitate several attempts on Snow White's life. All were thwarted, and the queen was made to wear red hot slippers that forced her to dance until she dropped dead. I love how dark the original versions are. So far, so Grimm's. So envy is a reaction to perceived injustice, that other people have something you lack. It's not fair. Resentment is the feeling of impotence in the face of envy, of other people having what you lack and being powerless. So where envy says it's not fair, resentment says if I can't have it, nobody can. And neither of these emotions are particularly socially acceptable. And one way to cope with frustrated desire is to convince yourself that the thing that's out of reach isn't worth having anyway, to sublimate your envy into contempt. I never wanted that thing anymore. It's beneath me. It's rubbish. And then there's the biggie, how to cope with that sense of inferiority that inevitably accompanies other people having something you lack. This is not a comfortable feeling. And the thing is that envy is subjective. It's aimed at people who are perceived to have more, regardless of whether or not they do. So regardless of whether the balance is swung from 100% to 0% or just to 99.9%. Envy is indifferent to the magnitude of inequality or to the inequality of harm. So we misunderstand bigotry when we think of it in terms of hate and overt discrimination and slurs and physical violence. Most bigotry does not come from a position of hate, but from a fear of what equality for marginalized groups will mean for them. Feeling threatened is the distinctive psychological experience of bigotry. So the true moral of Grimm's Snow White is not envy's bad, don't do an envy, kids. It's that the queen can literally change the way she looks by using her magic. She could make herself more beautiful than Snow White and reclaim the top spot. She could fix her perceived problem, but instead she chooses resentment and she makes herself ugly to trick and try to murder Snow White. So the possibility that the queen could have reached an amicable solution by improving herself instead of attacking Snow White is so far out of the purview of our culture that it doesn't even present itself as an option. And that is 1,000,000,000% my experience of trying to do D&I work. Somebody says something that's offensive to marginalized people, they're asked to stop. And instead of, oh, sorry, I didn't realize, and stopping, they respond with classic gaslighting behavior, where they deny that it was offensive or that anyone was offended or that they're responsible. You're just being too sensitive. And they attack the victim for attempting to hold them accountable. And they reverse the victim and offender. You're the one being offensive. My feelings have been hurt. Everybody should be treated with equality and respect. You're the real bully. And some people are more offended by the idea of being thoughtist than they are capable of acknowledging the humanity of marginalized people and that possibility of improving themselves and making themselves more beautiful with an apology and growth and learning, rather than attacking and dismissing marginalized people, is so far out of the purview of their culture that it doesn't present itself as an option. But wargaming has the tools to fix this. Empathy is a learnable skill, and it makes you a better wargamer. Serious games let you discuss without an actual person being in the room, being debated like an object. So you can talk about these difficult issues. And that's what the diversity card deck that I made for PAXsims does. It brings into the room diverse voices that are missing. And it lets you discuss them in a way that is not so defensive or so hurtful for minority people in the room. And I've seen guys harumphing loudly, oh, this doesn't happen here, reading the card deck. And his wife or partner or daughter will be looking over his shoulder saying, oh, that happens to me. Oh, and that. Oh, yeah, that happens too. Oh, God, that happens all the time. And it's like the clouds part and the God rays shine down and the heavenly choirs sing. And he realizes that this sort of stuff happens to people that he loves and respects. It's not just some nebulous other that kind of maybe sort of did something to deserve it. Serious games let you walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And sometimes people have to experience a thing to get it when their life has been really different. I think straight folks don't really think about how heteronormative everyday situations are. And being LGBT is about so much more than what you do in the bedroom. And non-disabled folks rarely think about access needs until they're trying to wheel a suitcase around or push a trolley full of equipment around the site, and they realize that they're confronted with how inadequate just take the long way round is as an everyday solution for disabled people. And as wargamers, we should be trying to play We should be playing to learn and grow and understand new things, not indulgently confirm the things that we already know. So serious games like Dog Eat Dog get to the heart of what we need to fix. So this is a game about the systemic oppression. So the setup's really simple. One person plays as the European colonial occupation of a Pacific island. They play as all of them, all the different people. And everybody else plays as individual natives on this island. And as money, the natives get a little, the occupation get a lot. The players take turns in setting a scene. So the scene includes your character and anybody that you want to invite by consent, apart from the occupation, who can crash a scene anytime they like and compel anyone to join a scene regardless of consent. And when there's conflict about what happens next in the story, control of the scene goes to whoever rolls highest, unless someone objects, and then the occupation take control, no matter who did the objecting. So you're starting to see the pattern here. After every scene, there's judgment. The occupation pays players for every rule they followed and fines them for every rule that they didn't follow. And then the natives come up with a new rule based on what they've just had rewarded or punished in the scene. And when the game starts, there's only one rule. The natives are inferior to the occupation, and that's it. You just have to follow this rule at all times. And the game ends when one side is out of money. So if the natives run out of money, that means all their leaders are dead, their culture's been suppressed. If the occupation run out of money, that means that the natives have been assimilated into the occupation society and granted autonomy at the low, low cost of their culture and dignity. And what this game so perfectly does is capture the power dynamic involved in discrimination. The natives can't win. The occupation has all the power to decide what's acceptable and what isn't, and is incentivized to use that power to take what they want without repercussions. They don't even write the rules that the natives get tied up trying to follow. So the game presents you with this wildly unfair system and asks you to live within it as best you can. And it never ends well for the natives. You can't cheat by trying to be nice. Even the benevolent occupation is disastrous. And everyone who played Dog Eat Dog with me got really uncomfortable with that rule. You know, it's too extreme. I don't think that most people don't behave that way. But look at the pattern of behavior that develops. You know, it's exactly the same results that Buenrus and Wold study looking at peer review finds, and that senior people are gateways to who progresses through the profession. And then we say, but you know, women and minorities just aren't good enough to be at the top, or they're not good enough to be in the war game. And what struck me most about the games that we played is that it's the role playing that makes it real to straight, white, non-disabled men. It's that feeling the awful sense that this is wrong and I'm powerless, and tying themselves in knots trying to manage the emotions of the dominant group when they've never had that perspective before, and being disabused of their naive ideas that minority groups just haven't done it right so far. And here comes a savior to show them, you know, this is how you do it, this is how you succeed. It's the role playing that makes them open their eyes and really hear what women and minorities have been saying, that it is hard and it's not that simple. And it's that active imaginative empathy that really teaches. So there's another role-playing game, Grey Ranks, about child soldiers during the Warsaw Uprising in World War II, and it perfectly captures the cost of putting D&I work onto minorities, the double bind of it, the inequality of harm, asking people to educate and challenge the bad behavior of folks who debate the legitimacy of their existence and who demean their humanity and behave as if they're less than. It's like asking turkeys to police Christmas dinner. So in Grey Ranks, there's the thing that your character holds dear. It's something important to you, and you and others can invoke it for advantage in dice rolls, but it can only be invoked 3 times. And the 3rd time it's used, it gets destroyed. And as the game progresses, success becomes increasingly difficult, and you're faced with these difficult choices. Is achieving a goal worth destroying the thing your character holds dear? And your character moves about on this grid which tracks the individual player's position on opposing extremes of love and hate and enthusiasm and exhaustion. And so in the game, success and failure will pull them in unexpected directions where these strong currents intersect with death and heartbreak. And it's metaphorically, and in some cases, you know, literally, exactly what we do when we push minorities forward to do the uncomfortable work of D&I. If minorities don't do it, they're the ones that suffer because the same things continue to happen. The letters continue to get posted in the box where the birds are trying to nest. But when we do it, we have our wounds, our most raw and painful wounds poked and debated in public, and we're expected to be endlessly tolerant and generous towards people who are just not treating us with the same respect in return. We're expected to allow our feelings to be hurt so that other people can learn to be better human beings, and it's a recipe for burnout. But serious games make space for allies to address those issues for us. So I wrote an essay about how it's literally art when we get it right. Serious games really can change the world, and wargaming is that beautiful when it's at its best. So before I throw it open to questions, a word from our sponsors, the Derby House Principles for Diversity and Inclusion in Wargaming, named after Derby House and the WATU-related, of course. So one really simple thing that you can do as an ally is to cite the example of WATU at the beginning of your game or your event or your presentation. And it sends a really simple message of representation that all of you belong, that you have always belonged in wargaming, and that you all have contributions to make. And it primes people that similar diversity, which is not always visible, is present in the room. So Phillips, from one of the earlier diversity studies, on the small group discussions, he says, if people are explicitly forewarned that unique perspectives are present, groups are better able to share and integrate unique information into the discussion. So just by saying that WATU exists at the beginning of your war game, you improve the quality of your war game. So over to you for questions.
Hello, everyone. So just a quick reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat, and I will ask them on your behalf. And while we're getting our first couple questions from players or participants, for me as a wargamer, Sally, looking back through some of the research that I've done and research obstacles, I'm really curious as how you found Helen Coop and how you track down these primary subject sources. And can you talk a little bit more about your experience and maybe the time or resources you had to put into doing that?
Yeah, so finding Helen Coop was good fun. So all I knew was that newspaper article that said Helen, daughter of a canon. And I just started looking for people in births and deaths of around that time called Helen, whose father was a canon. And I really lucked out because her father, John Cooper, was Padre at the Somme and was mentioned in dispatches, and then wrote the papers of his division up, and they got published, and then he became canon at the cathedral. So he was relatively easy to find. But mostly I've just been using resources like Ancestry and guessing, like just trotting through looking for names, because I've got some names from places and I just kind of people with these names born around this time, and then try to get in touch with anyone still alive in their families. And sometimes I found people, sometimes it's been dead ends. But so far I've been able to contact 2 living WATU Wrens and another Derby House Wren who married one of the WATU staff. So I found one in Canada. That was pretty cool. She came up on a BBC News article because she was protesting the expat pensions thing that our government does, which is not very good. So she was in a BBC News article, and it just happened to mention in her war service as a Wren, and it said she was in a tactical school, which was like, oh, what is this? So I emailed the expat pensions advocacy group saying, can I maybe be put in touch with Anne, please, to talk about that? And it turns out that she was at the Bombay Tactical Unit, what this picture is taken from, as a Wren. So her father was in the army in India before the war, and they were unable to travel home because of restrictions before the war. So she joined the RINs, so the Royal Indian Navy's version of the Wrens. And she originally had a staff job there, and then they asked her to come over to Liverpool to learn the WATU game, and then set up the Bombay Tactical Unit in the Pacific. So they thought with the end of the war in Europe that the Pacific would become as big as the Battle of the Atlantic had. And in the end, it didn't turn out that way. So they formed the unit, but mostly they just did demonstrations of exciting naval actions rather than having any tactical problems to look at themselves. But she's alive and well in Canada, and we had a lovely conversation. And she sounds like a terrific woman.
That's awesome. I know for me, my World War II history encapsulates the Holocaust and going through Yad Vashem, and that's a really good resource. So I'm hearing, ancestry.com sometimes can be just as valuable in finding people, particularly people who were overlooked or had their names misspelled in articles. So if anyone
it's really the only way to find World War II veterans at the moment, because their records are sealed and the census is still sealed until they're 100 years after their birth, just to protect their privacy. So unless you can prove that they have died, you can't access their records. So you have to go through family. Whereas World War I, it's much easier because all of those census records have been released.
I'm flabbergasted. That sounds really insane. And this is coming from somebody who's, on Wikipedia and very disappointed in the lack of insight in Latin American history and Latin American conflict and wars and stuff. So similarly, I might actually have to chat with you more offline about how to find some of these people who are overlooked in
we can do that. So do we have questions?
I am not seeing any questions in the chat. Maybe we gave people a bit much to think about, or maybe I accidentally turned the chat off. No, chat is on. If there's no questions, I will go ahead and end the recording. If people would like to still ask Sally questions, ask me questions about Georgetown University Wargaming Society, please feel free to hang on. We'll hang out for about 5 minutes afterwards.